The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse office as John Marshall stared at the city sprawling below him. At 38, he had everything money could buy: a tech empire worth $300 million, a mansion in the Hollywood Hills, cars that cost more than most people's houses. Yet as he watched his reflection blur in the rain-streaked glass, he felt more isolated than ever. The irony wasn't lost on him. Marshall Digital Solutions connected millions of people worldwide through social platforms and communication apps. But John couldn't remember the last time he'd had a genuine conversation with another human being. Every interaction was transactional, every smile calculated, every relationship built on what he could provide rather than who he was. His phone buzzed with another urgent message from his assistant. The Jakarta expansion was behind schedule. The board meeting had been moved up, and 3 different department heads needed his immediate attention. John ignored it all. Today was different. Today, he was going home early, not to work, but to meet his 3-week-old daughter for the first time since bringing her home from the hospital. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive through Beverly Hills felt surreal. John had purchased the 8-bedroom estate 2 years ago as an investment, barely spending more than a few nights there each month. Most of his time was consumed by the downtown office or business trips to London, Tokyo, and Silicon Valley. Home had become just another address, another piece of property in his expanding portfolio. His wife Victoria had handled everything regarding the baby's arrival with her typical efficiency. The nursery was professionally designed, the nanny service vetted through 3 different agencies, and every detail managed through their respective assistants. Even the birth itself had felt like a business meeting. John arriving at Cedars-Sinai between conference calls, staying long enough for the obligatory photos, then rushing back to finalize the merger that had consumed 6 months of negotiations. As the iron gates of his estate swung open, John realized he didn't even know his daughter's feeding schedule, her sleep patterns, or whether she had begun to show any personality yet. The thought sent an unexpected pang through his chest, a feeling he quickly suppressed as weakness. The house loomed before him, all modern angles and imported stone, looking more like a luxury hotel than a family home. John had spared no expense on its construction, demanding the finest materials and most innovative smart home technology. Yet stepping through the front door always felt like entering a beautiful museum rather than a sanctuary. Mr. Marshall. The voice belonged to Elena Rodriguez, the housekeeper who had been managing the property since its completion. At 52, she moved with quiet efficiency, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, her uniform impeccable despite having worked a full day. "We weren't expecting you home this early." "I wanted to see the baby," John said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. He loosened his Italian silk tie and glanced around the marble foyer. "Where is everyone?" "Mrs. Marshall is at her book club meeting downtown. She won't return until after dinner. The night nurse doesn't arrive for another 2 hours. Eleanor paused, studying his face with the kind of careful attention that came from years of reading wealthy employers' moods. "Would you like me to check if little Emma is awake?" Emma? His daughter's name was Emma. John felt heat rise in his cheeks at the realization that he'd had to be reminded. "Yes, please." As Elena disappeared up the curved staircase, John wandered into the living room, where everything sat in perfect, untouched arrangement. The white leather furniture looked as pristine as the day it was delivered. Crystal vases held fresh orchids that were replaced twice weekly by a florist service. The walls displayed carefully curated contemporary art pieces that had been selected not for personal meaning, but for their investment potential. This wasn't a home where a child was learning to crawl, where toys would scatter across expensive rugs, where sticky fingers would leave marks on glass surfaces. This was a showplace, designed to impress business associates and society photographers, not to nurture a family. The sound of crying drifted down from the second floor, not the sharp, demanding wail John had expected, but a softer, more plaintive sound that seemed to echo through the house's vast spaces. He climbed the stairs, following the sound toward what he assumed was the nursery. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by something even more unexpected, singing. John froze in the hallway, listening to a voice he didn't recognize, warm, melodic, and completely unlike anything he'd heard in this sterile mansion. The woman was singing in Spanish, her voice carrying a tenderness that seemed to transform the very air around it. Duérmete, mi niña. Duérmete, mi amor. Duérmete, pedazo de mi corazón. He found himself moving toward the partially open door, drawn by the haunting beauty of the lullaby. Through the gap, he could see into the nursery that Victoria's designer had crafted in shades of cream and gold. But the expensive furniture faded into the background as John focused on the scene before him. A young woman sat in the rocking chair he'd never seen used, cradling his daughter against her chest. She couldn't have been more than 25, with long dark hair falling in waves over her shoulders and kind eyes that seemed to hold infinite patience. She wore a simple grey uniform, one of the cleaning service employees he'd never bothered to notice during his brief visits home. But it wasn't just her presence that stopped John cold. It was the way she held Emma, as if the baby were made of precious crystal and starlight. It was the gentle sway of her body as she rocked, the soft humming between verses, the complete absorption in this moment that existed outside of schedules and obligations. Emma had stopped crying entirely, her tiny fist curled around the woman's finger, her eyes, John's eyes. He realized with a start, gazing up with the kind of trust and contentment he'd never seen in his daughter's face before. "Mi pequeña princesa," the woman whispered, switching to English with only the faintest accent. "You're safe now. No more tears, little one. Tomorrow the sun will shine just for you, and all the world will sing your name." John had built his fortune on reading people, on understanding what motivated them, and how to leverage those motivations for his advantage. But standing in that doorway, watching this stranger comfort his daughter with more natural grace than he'd ever witnessed, he found himself completely disarmed. Who was this woman? Why was she here alone with Emma when the household staff should have been managing the baby's care through proper channels? And why did watching her sing to his daughter create such a strange ache in his chest, a longing for something he couldn't even name? The questions multiplied as he stood there, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, afraid to break the spell of this unexpected scene. For the first time in years, John Marshall felt like an outsider in his own life, watching something real and beautiful happen in a world he'd built but never learned to inhabit. The lullaby continued, each note seeming to weave a cocoon of peace around the crying that had filled the house just moments before. And John found himself holding his breath, afraid that any movement might shatter this fragile moment of grace that had somehow bloomed in the midst of his carefully controlled existence. The spell broke when John's phone vibrated against his chest pocket. The woman, he still didn't know her name, looked up sharply, her dark eyes meeting his through the crack in the door. For a moment neither moved. Emma stirred slightly but remained peaceful in the stranger's arms. "Mr. Marshall." The woman's voice carried surprise but no fear, no guilt at being caught in what most employers would consider an unauthorized situation. She began to rise from the rocking chair with careful movements that kept Emma undisturbed. "I didn't realize you were home." John pushed the door open fully, stepping into the nursery for the first time since its completion. The room felt different with life in it, warmer somehow, despite the perfectly controlled climate system. "Please don't get up." "She seems comfortable." The woman studied his face, perhaps reading the genuine confusion there. "She was crying for almost an hour. Mrs. Rodriguez asked me to check on her while she prepared your dinner." "I hope that was appropriate, Mrs. Rodriguez." John realized how little he knew about the daily operations of his own household. "You work for the cleaning service?" A small smile crossed the woman's lips. "I'm Maria Santos. I've been cleaning your home twice a week for 8 months now." She paused, then added with gentle directness, "Though I understand why you might not remember. You're usually at the office during my shifts. 8 months. This woman had been moving through his house, caring for his possessions, maintaining the space where he lived, and he'd never once acknowledged her existence. The realization struck him with unexpected force. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming out rougher than intended. "That's inexcusable on my part." Maria's expression softened. "You're a busy man, Mr. Marshall. I know your work is important." She looked down at Emma, who had begun to make small, contented sounds. "But she knows your voice already." When you were talking just now, she turned her head toward the door. John moved closer, studying his daughter's face with new attention. Emma's features were still forming, but he could see hints of his own stubborn jawline, Victoria's elegant nose. Her hair was dark like Maria's, he noticed absurdly, before remembering that most babies were born with dark hair that would likely change. "May I?" John hesitated, realizing he was about to ask permission to hold his own child. "Would it be all right if I took her for a moment?" "Of course." Maria rose gracefully, transferring Emma with the practiced ease of someone comfortable with infants. "Support her head like this and keep her close to your chest. She likes to hear heartbeats." The weight of his daughter in his arms was lighter than John had expected, but the responsibility felt immense. Emma's eyes opened, focusing on his face with the intense concentration babies brought to studying new things. Her tiny hand escaped from her swaddle, fingers opening and closing reflexively. "Hello, Emma," John whispered, surprised by the tremor in his own voice. "I'm your father." It sounded strange, that word. Father. John had been CEO, entrepreneur, merger specialist, market disruptor, titles that came with clear definitions and measurable success metrics. But father? That role came with no manual, no board of directors, no quarterly reviews to gauge performance. "She has your eyes," Maria observed, settling back into the rocking chair but remaining alert, ready to assist if needed. "Very serious, very thoughtful. Even at 3 weeks old, she studies everything like she's trying to understand how the world works. Is that normal? For babies to be so aware? Every baby is different. But Emma, she's special. Very alert, very responsive. She doesn't cry just to cry. She's always trying to communicate something specific." Maria's voice carried the kind of knowledge that came from genuine observation rather than textbook learning. "When she's hungry, it's a sharp, demanding sound. When she's tired, it's more of a fuss. When she's lonely—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "When she's lonely, she cries like she was doing when you arrived. Soft and sad, like she's calling for someone to love her." The words hit John like a physical blow. His daughter had been crying from loneliness, and instead of parents rushing to comfort her, she'd been soothed by someone who wasn't even supposed to be caring for children. Someone who was here only because the paid professionals hadn't yet arrived for their shift. "How do you know so much about babies?" John asked, genuinely curious rather than suspicious. "I have 3 younger brothers. My mother worked 2 jobs when I was growing up, so I helped raise them." Maria's smile held warmth and a trace of old sadness. "But also I pay attention. Children tell you what they need if you listen carefully enough." Emma made a small sound, not crying, but a soft vocalization that seemed almost conversational. John looked down at her, then back at Maria. "What is she saying now?" "She's content, safe. She likes being held by you." Maria leaned forward slightly. "But she's also getting tired. See how her eyelids are getting heavy? If you rock gently, she'll probably fall asleep in your arms." John began a tentative swaying motion, watching Emma's face for signs of approval or distress. Her eyes did seem to be growing heavier, her body relaxing more completely against his chest. The sensation was unlike anything he'd experienced. This tiny person trusting him completely, depending on him for comfort and security. "The lullaby you were singing," John said softly, not wanting to wake Emma as her breathing began to even out. "What does it mean?" "Sleep, my child, sleep, my love, sleep, little piece of my heart," Maria translated. "It's what my grandmother used to sing to me when I was small. The melody is supposed to match a mother's heartbeat, to help babies feel safe. It's beautiful." John meant it. Could you teach it to me? Something shifted in Maria's expression. Surprise, perhaps, but also a kind of recognition. You want to learn to sing to Emma? I want to learn how to be her father, John said, the admission coming out before he could stop it. I built this house, hired the best services money can buy, made sure she'll never want for anything material. But I don't know how to comfort her when she cries. I don't know what her different sounds mean. I don't even know what time she usually eats or sleeps. The silence stretched between them, broken only by Emma's soft breathing and the distant sound of Elena preparing dinner downstairs. John expected judgment, perhaps polite suggestions to hire more qualified help. Instead, Maria nodded slowly. Learning to be a parent isn't about money or services, she said gently. It's about being present, being patient, and paying attention to who your child actually is, rather than who you think she should be. Will you help me? The question surprised John as much as it seemed to surprise Maria. Not as an employee, not as part of any formal arrangement, just, will you help me learn how to be present for my daughter? Maria was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to read his sincerity. Finally she nodded. Yes, Mr. Marshall. I'll help you learn to be Emma's father. As if sensing the significance of the moment, Emma settled more deeply into sleep, her tiny fist curling against John's shirt. For the first time since her birth, John felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 weeks had passed since John's arrangement with Maria began, and the changes in the Marshall household were becoming impossible to ignore. Every Tuesday and Friday, when Maria arrived for her regular cleaning duties, she would spend an extra hour teaching John the subtle art of fatherhood. What had started as basic lessons in holding and feeding Emma had evolved into something far more complex. John found himself rearranging his schedule in ways that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Conference calls were moved, meetings shortened, and for the first time in his career, he delegated responsibilities that he'd previously insisted on handling personally. His assistant, Jennifer, had initially assumed he was ill when he began leaving the office at reasonable hours. The Singapore investors are expecting your call at midnight, she'd reminded him the previous evening, barely concealing her confusion when John had shaken his head. Reschedule it. Emma has been sleeping poorly, and I want to be home for her bedtime routine. The look on Jennifer's face had been priceless, as if he'd announced plans to abandon technology and become a monk. But John was discovering that the demands of fatherhood operated on a different timeline than business negotiations, one that couldn't be optimized or streamlined. This particular Friday evening, Maria was teaching him about developmental milestones, while Emma lay on a soft blanket spread across the living room floor. At 6 weeks old, she was beginning to track objects with her eyes and respond to voices with small coos and gurgles. See how she turns toward your voice? Maria pointed out as John spoke to Emma in the gentle tone he'd been practicing. She's learning to associate that sound with safety and comfort. But watch what happens when we introduce something new. Maria produced a small rattle from her bag. Nothing expensive or high-tech, just a simple wooden toy with a few beads inside. As she shook it gently, Emma's eyes widened, her tiny body tensing with concentration. She's processing the sound, trying to understand where it comes from, Maria explained. This is how babies learn about cause and effect. The rattle makes noise, but she doesn't yet understand that someone has to shake it to create the sound. John watched, fascinated, as Emma's expression shifted from surprise to curiosity. Her arms moved in jerky, uncontrolled motions, not yet reaching for the rattle, but showing awareness of its presence. When will she be able to grab things deliberately? Around 3 to 4 months, she'll start reaching with intention. By 6 months, she'll be able to transfer objects from one hand to another. Maria smiled at Emma's attempts to focus on the rattle. But right now, she's working on much more important things, learning to trust, learning that her needs will be met, learning that the world is a safe place to explore. The front door chimed with its electronic melody, signaling Victoria's return from her weekly dinner with the wives of other tech executives. John felt his shoulders tense automatically, a response that had become increasingly common as the distance between him and his wife seemed to grow wider each day. Victoria's heels clicked across the marble foyer, the sound sharp and purposeful. She appeared in the living room doorway, still elegant in her black designer dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the evening's social obligations. "John, they didn't expect you to be home yet." Her gaze took in the scene, her husband sitting cross-legged on the floor, the housekeeper with a baby toy, Emma lying on a blanket that definitely wasn't part of the nursery's expensive decor. "What's going on here?" "I'm learning about Emma's development," John said, his voice carefully neutral. Maria was explaining how babies process new sensory information. Victoria's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see, Maria, isn't your shift supposed to end at 6? "Mrs. Marshall," Maria began, rising gracefully from where she'd been sitting beside Emma. "Mr. Marshall asked me to—" "It's my fault," John interrupted, standing as well. "I asked Maria to help me understand Emma's needs better. She's been incredibly generous with her time." The tension in the room was palpable. Emma, sensing the change in atmosphere, began to fuss, small, worried sounds that threatened to escalate into crying. "Well," Victoria said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, "I'm sure we can manage our daughter's care through the proper channels. The pediatrician gives us developmental updates at each appointment, and the night nurse is trained in infant care." Maria bent to pick up the wooden rattle, her movements careful and deliberate. "Of course, Mrs. Marshall, I should finish cleaning the kitchen and then head home." As Maria gathered her things and quietly left the room, John felt a strange sense of loss. The easy intimacy of the learning session had evaporated, replaced by the formal distance that seemed to characterize every interaction in this house. "John," Victoria said once they were alone, her voice taking on the tone she used for difficult conversations, "I need to discuss something with you." Emma's fussing had escalated to genuine crying. John knelt down and carefully lifted her, trying to remember Maria's instructions about supporting her head while keeping her close to his chest. The crying continued. "She's probably hungry," Victoria observed. "The night nurse should be here soon to handle the feeding." "I can feed her," John said, swaying gently as he'd learned to do. "I've been learning how to prepare her bottles." "You've been learning from the housekeeper," Victoria corrected, and there was something sharp in her voice now. "John, I'm concerned about these arrangements you've been making." Emma's crying grew louder, and John found himself walking in slow circles around the room, trying to recreate the soothing motion that had worked earlier. But without Maria's calm presence, without her gentle guidance, he felt clumsy and inadequate. "What arrangements?" John asked, though part of him already knew where this conversation was heading. "You're paying a cleaning woman to provide childcare services she's not qualified for. You're creating inappropriate dependencies." Victoria moved to the bar cart and poured herself a glass of wine, her movements sharp with controlled anger. "What happens when Maria decides she wants more money for these extra duties? What happens when she realizes she has leverage over the Marshall family?" The words hit John like ice water. "It's not like that, Victoria. Maria is an employee, John, a service provider. The fact that she's managed to convince you that she's essential to our daughter's well-being is exactly what I'm talking about." Emma's crying reached a crescendo, and John felt his own frustration rising to match it. Nothing he was doing seemed to help, and Victoria's cold analysis was making everything worse. "She hasn't convinced me of anything," John said, raising his voice to be heard over Emma's distress. "She's teaching me how to be a father. She's helping me understand our daughter in ways that no amount of money or professional services has managed to do." "And what exactly does that say about me, John?" Victoria's question was quiet, but loaded with implications. "What does it say about us as parents that you need a stranger to teach you how to care for your own child?" The accusation hung in the air between them, impossible to answer without acknowledging truths that neither of them seemed ready to face. Emma continued crying, her small body rigid with distress, and John realized that for all his newfound knowledge about developmental milestones and sensory processing, he still felt helpless when it mattered most. The electronic chime announced the night nurse's arrival, and Victoria moved toward the foyer with obvious relief. "Margaret will take care of Emma now," she called over her shoulder. "We can discuss this situation further when the baby is settled," but as the professionally trained nurse efficiently took Emma from his arms and immediately began the practiced motions that quieted her crying, John felt something inside him rebel against the suggestion that love could be outsourced, that connection could be scheduled, and that the most important relationship of his life should be managed through proper channels rather than genuine presence. The revelation came on a Tuesday morning when John arrived home unexpectedly to find his house in chaos. Emma's piercing screams echoed through the marble halls, punctuated by sharp voices arguing in the kitchen. He'd left the office early for what was supposed to be a routine check-in with his home security system. But something was clearly wrong. Margaret, the night nurse, stood in the living room looking frazzled and defensive, Emma wailing inconsolably in her arms. John had never seen the usually composed professional appear so rattled. "Mr. Marshall, thank goodness you're here," Margaret said over the crying. "She's been like this for 3 hours. Nothing I do seems to help, and Mrs. Rodriguez and I were just discussing—" "Where's Maria?" John interrupted, moving quickly toward Margaret to take Emma. The moment his daughter was in his arms, her crying diminished slightly, though she remained clearly distressed. "That's what we need to discuss," came Victoria's voice from the kitchen doorway. She emerged looking immaculate despite the chaos, her expression set in grim determination. "Margaret, could you please give us some privacy?" The nurse gathered her supplies with obvious relief and disappeared upstairs. Elena Rodriguez remained in the kitchen, her presence somehow protective, even from a distance. John found himself grateful for her silent support. "Victoria, what's going on? Where's Maria?" "I terminated her employment yesterday," Victoria said, her tone matter-of-fact despite the bombshell she'd just dropped. "I should have consulted with you first, but the situation had become untenable." The words hit John like a physical blow. Emma's crying intensified, as if she could sense his shock and distress. "You did what?" "Without discussing it with me." "John, please try to see this rationally." The woman had completely overstepped her boundaries. She was essentially providing unauthorized childcare, creating dependency relationships, and frankly, I was concerned about liability issues. John stared at his wife, trying to process what she was telling him. Maria was gone. The person who had taught him Emma's different cries, who had shown him how to read his daughter's needs, who had helped him feel competent and connected as a father. Victoria had simply eliminated her from their lives. "What did you say to her?" John asked, his voice dangerously. "Quiet. I explained that we no longer required her cleaning services and that we'd found her behavior inappropriate given her position in our household." Victoria moved to the coffee machine, her movements deliberately casual. "I provided 2 weeks' severance, which was more than generous, considering she wasn't technically entitled to any notice period." Emma's distress was escalating, and John found himself walking in circles, trying every soothing technique Maria had taught him. But without her calm guidance, without her reassuring presence, everything felt wrong. "You fired her because she was helping me be a better father," John said, the accusation clear in his voice. "I fired her because she was manipulating the situation to her advantage." John, think about this logically. A cleaning woman convinces a wealthy executive that he needs her specialized knowledge to care for his own child. She was positioning herself as indispensable. She wasn't positioning herself as anything. John's voice rose, causing Emma to cry harder. "She was genuinely helping us." "She was helping Emma." Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "Emma is fine, John. She's a baby. Babies cry. Margaret is professionally trained in infant care. We don't need a housekeeper playing amateur nanny. Look at her." John gestured to Emma, whose distress seemed inconsolable. Does she seem fine to you? Margaret has been trying for 3 hours to calm her down. 3 hours, Victoria. Babies have difficult days. It's normal. But as John looked at his daughter's red, tear-streaked face, he knew this wasn't normal fussiness. Emma's crying had a desperate quality to it, a sound he'd learned to recognize over the past weeks. She wasn't just hungry or tired or uncomfortable. She was grieving. She's looking for Maria, John said quietly, the realization hitting him with devastating clarity. Emma has bonded with her. She's crying because someone she trusted and loved has disappeared from her life without explanation. That's ridiculous. John, infants don't form complex emotional attachments to— Yes, they do. John's shout silenced Victoria mid-sentence. That's exactly what they do. That's what Maria was teaching me. Babies aren't just feeding and sleeping schedules. They're people, with feelings and needs and the capacity to love and trust. And Emma loved Maria. The silence that followed was broken only by Emma's continued crying, which had taken on a heartbreaking quality that made John's chest ache. He thought about all the moments he'd witnessed between Maria and his daughter, the gentle songs, the patient rocking, the soft Spanish endearments that had always calmed Emma when nothing else would. I need to find her, John said suddenly. I need to bring Maria back. John, be reasonable. We can't what? Admit that we made a mistake? Admit that firing someone who genuinely cared about our daughter was cruel and short-sighted? John was pacing again, Emma's weight familiar in his arms now, even as her distress continued. Do you even know where she lives? Do you know if she has another job lined up? Do you know if she can afford to be without work for 2 weeks? Victoria's silence spoke volumes. You don't know anything about her, do you? John continued, his voice filled with growing anger and self-recrimination. Neither did I until recently. We've had this woman in our home for 8 months, trusted her with our most precious possessions, and we never bothered to learn who she actually is. She's the help, John. We pay people to provide services, not to become personally involved in our lives. The callousness of the statement stopped John cold. She's a person, Victoria. A person who showed more genuine care for our daughter in 6 weeks than we've managed in 2 months. Emma's crying had shifted to exhausted, hiccuping sobs, her small body trembling with the effort. John felt completely helpless, all of Maria's careful lessons seeming inadequate in the face of this crisis. I'm going to find her, he announced, moving toward the stairs. I'm going to bring her back and apologize for how we've treated her. And then what? Victoria called after him. You'll what? Promote the cleaning lady to nanny? Pay her what exactly for services we never formally requested? John, think about the legal implications. Think about what this looks like. John stopped at the base of the staircase, Emma finally beginning to quiet in his arms as exhaustion overcame her distress. When he turned to face his wife, something fundamental had shifted in his expression. I don't care what it looks like, Victoria. I care about what it is. And what it is a family that's failing its most vulnerable member because we're too proud and too isolated to accept help from someone who genuinely loves her. He climbed the stairs, leaving Victoria standing alone in their perfect living room, surrounded by all the beautiful, expensive things that had failed to teach them how to be parents, how to be human, or how to recognize love when it was freely offered. In the nursery, John settled into the rocking chair where he'd first seen Maria singing to Emma. His daughter had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, but even in slumber, her breathing hitched occasionally with leftover distress. I'm sorry, baby girl, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. Daddy's going to fix this, I promise. But as he sat there in the expensive silence of his perfect house, John realized that fixing this would require him to confront truths about his marriage, his values, and his definition of family that he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The investigation began at dawn. John had spent the sleepless night formulating a plan that felt both desperate and necessary. If Victoria wouldn't tell him how to find Maria, he would use every resource at his disposal to locate her himself. What he discovered in the process would change everything he thought he knew about the woman who had quietly transformed his understanding of fatherhood. Elena Rodriguez proved to be his unexpected ally. When John approached her in the kitchen that morning, she was preparing Emma's bottles with the methodical precision that had kept the Marshall household running smoothly for years. "Elena, I need your help," John said without preamble. "I need to find Maria Santos." The older woman's hands paused in their work, her dark eyes studying his face with careful attention. "Mrs. Marshall said Maria wouldn't be coming back. Mrs. Marshall made that decision without consulting me. I need to speak with Maria to apologize for how she was treated." John's voice carried a rawness that seemed to convince Eleanor of his sincerity. "Do you know where she lives? How I can contact her?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing loyalties and consequences. Finally, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small piece of paper with an address written in careful handwriting. "She lives in East L.A. with her family," Elena said quietly. "But Mr. Marshall, you should know, Maria doesn't have a phone. And the address, it's not in a neighborhood where people like you usually go." The judgment in her words wasn't harsh, but it was honest. John realized that in all his wealth and success, he'd never ventured into the communities where people like Maria lived, worked, and raised their families. "Will you come with me?" he asked. "I don't want to make things worse by showing up unexpectedly." Elena's surprise was evident, but she nodded slowly. "Let me call my cousin. He knows the Santos family." 2 hours later, John found himself driving his Tesla through neighborhoods that might as well have been on another planet. The contrast was jarring, from the manicured perfection of Beverly Hills to streets lined with small houses, apartment buildings with bars on windows, and corner stores advertising services in Spanish. Elena directed him to a modest duplex with a tiny front yard where children's toys were scattered on grass that had been worn bare in patches. The sight of the toys sent an unexpected pang through John's chest as he thought about Emma, who would never play in a yard like this, whose childhood would be carefully curated and professionally managed. "That's Maria's car," Elena said, pointing to an old Honda Civic parked on the street. "She's probably home." John stared at the house, suddenly uncertain. What right did he have to show up here, in Maria's private space, seeking her help after his wife had so callously dismissed her? What could he possibly say that would undo the humiliation Victoria had inflicted? The front door opened before he could decide, and Maria emerged, apparently having spotted the distinctive car from her window. She wore jeans and a simple T-shirt, her long hair loose around her shoulders, looking younger and somehow more vulnerable than she had in her work uniform. She approached the car slowly, her expression guarded but not hostile. John rolled down the window, feeling more nervous than he had before any business negotiation. "Mr. Marshall," Maria said, her voice carefully neutral. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Maria, I'm so sorry," John began, the words tumbling out faster than he'd planned. "I had no idea Victoria was going to—" "I would never have agreed to what she did. It was wrong and unfair, and I need to make it right." Maria glanced at Eleanor, who nodded encouragingly, then back at John. "Would you like to come inside? We shouldn't have this conversation in the street." The interior of Maria's home was a revelation. The space was small but immaculately maintained, filled with warmth that John's mansion had never achieved despite its expensive decor. Family photographs covered every surface, showing Maria with her brothers at various ages, graduation ceremonies, birthday celebrations. The furniture was simple but comfortable, and the walls were painted in warm colors that made the rooms feel embracing rather than confining. "Please, sit," Maria said, gesturing to a couch covered with a hand-crocheted throw. "Can I offer you coffee?" John accepted, grateful for something to do with his hands, as Maria moved efficiently around the small kitchen. Through the window he could see children playing in the backyard of the neighboring house, their laughter carrying through the thin walls. "Maria, I need you to know that I had nothing to do with Victoria's decision," John said, as she handed him a mug of coffee that smelled rich and complex. "I came home to find Emma inconsolable and learned what had happened. She's been heartbroken without you." Something flickered in Maria's eyes at the mention of Emma, but her expression remained carefully controlled. Mrs. Marshall made her position very clear. She felt I had overstepped my boundaries as a cleaning person. "You did overstep your boundaries," John said, causing Maria to look up in surprise. "You went far beyond what we had any right to expect from someone we hired to clean our house. You gave us something we didn't deserve and certainly didn't pay for. You gave us your care, your knowledge, your genuine concern for our daughter's well-being." Maria was quiet, studying his face as if trying to determine his sincerity. "I want to offer you a different job," John continued. "Not as a cleaning person, but as Emma's nanny. Full-time, with proper compensation, benefits, everything you'd need to make this a real career opportunity. Mr. Marshall." "John, please." "Just call me John." "John," Maria said carefully. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure it would work. Your wife was very clear about her feelings regarding my presence in your home." "Then we'll have to change her mind," John said with more confidence than he felt. "Emma needs you, Maria, and honestly, so do I. You've taught me more about being a father in 6 weeks than all the parenting books and professional services combined." Maria set down her coffee mug and leaned back in her chair. "Can I tell you something? About why I love working with children?" John nodded. "When I was 7, my father left us. My mother was working 2 jobs to support me and my baby brother, and I became responsible for taking care of him while she was gone." Maria's voice carried old pain, but also strength. "I learned that children don't need perfect parents or expensive things. They need presence. They need someone who pays attention, who responds to their needs, who makes them feel safe and loved. That's exactly what you gave Emma," John said quietly. "But I also learned something else," Maria continued. "I learned that love isn't something you can hire. It's not a service you can purchase. It's something that grows between people when they're truly present with each other." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that John was only beginning to understand. "You're saying I can't just hire you to love my daughter." "I'm saying that love, real love, is something that happens naturally when people genuinely care about each other's well-being. It can't be forced, and it can't be stopped by employment contracts or social boundaries." Maria's smile was gentle but sad. "I already love Emma. I loved her the first time I held her crying in that big empty house. But the question isn't whether I'll accept your job offer, John. The question is whether you're ready to create a home where love can actually flourish." As John sat in Maria's warm, imperfect living room, surrounded by evidence of a life built on relationships rather than achievements, he realized that bringing Maria back wouldn't solve his problems. It would only postpone the moment when he'd have to confront the fundamental emptiness at the heart of his family's existence. But looking at the photographs of Maria's brothers, seeing the evidence of a woman who had dedicated her life to caring for others, John felt something he hadn't experienced in years, hoped that it wasn't too late to learn what really mattered. John returned home to find his world unraveling in ways he hadn't anticipated. Victoria's car was gone from the driveway, and the house felt different, not just empty, but deliberately abandoned. Emma's cries echoed from upstairs, where Margaret was once again struggling to provide comfort that seemed beyond her professional capabilities. The note was waiting on the kitchen counter, written in Victoria's precise handwriting on expensive stationery that somehow made the words feel even colder. "John, I've taken a room at the Beverly Hills Hotel while I consider our situation. Your behavior today, tracking down a dismissed employee, involving household staff in personal matters, has made it clear that we have fundamentally different views about family, boundaries, and appropriate conduct. I won't be party to whatever fantasy you're constructing about playing house with the help. Emma deserves parents who can provide stability and proper guidance, not emotional chaos driven by your midlife crisis. My attorney will be in touch regarding temporary arrangements." "Victoria, The paper trembled in John's hands as the implications sank in. Victoria wasn't just angry about Maria, she was questioning their entire marriage. The clinical tone of the note, the mention of attorneys, the calculated cruelty of reducing his awakening as a father to a midlife crisis. It all pointed to decisions that had been forming long before today's confrontation. Mr. Marshall. Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking frazzled and apologetic. "I'm sorry, but Emma won't settle down. She's refusing her bottle, and I've tried everything I know. Perhaps we should call the pediatrician." John climbed the stairs to the nursery, each step feeling heavier than the last. Emma's crying had taken on the same desperate quality it had the day Maria was fired, a sound that went beyond physical discomfort into something deeper and more heartbreaking. As he lifted his daughter from her crib, John realized that Emma wasn't the only one who had become dependent on Maria's presence. Over the past weeks, he'd grown to rely on Maria's calm wisdom, her gentle guidance, her ability to help him feel competent and connected as a father. Without her, he felt as lost and inadequate as his crying daughter. "Shh, baby girl," he whispered, walking the familiar circuit around the nursery. "Daddy's here. Daddy's going to figure this out." But even as he spoke the words, John felt their hollowness. How could he figure anything out when his life was falling apart? His wife had left him, threatened divorce proceedings, and dismissed his attempts at becoming a better father as some kind of psychological breakdown. His daughter was inconsolable, missing someone who had been ripped from her life without explanation. And Maria, the one person who might be able to help, had every reason to want nothing more to do with the Marshall family after the way they had treated her. The hours that followed were among the darkest of John's life. Emma would calm briefly in his arms, only to start crying again the moment he tried to put her down. Margaret offered to take the night shift, but John couldn't bear the thought of his daughter spending another night with someone who, however well-intentioned, couldn't provide the comfort she needed. Around midnight, exhausted and desperate, John found himself doing something he hadn't done since childhood. He began to pray. Not to any specific deity, but to whatever force in the universe might be listening to a man who had finally realized how completely he had lost his way. "Please," he whispered into Emma's soft hairs. She finally dozed fitfully against his chest. "Please help me know what to do. Help me be the father she needs. Help me fix what I've broken." The house phone rang at 2 a.m, startling both John and Emma awake. He answered quickly, hoping to prevent another crying episode. "John, it's Elena." The housekeeper's voice was tight with worry. "I'm sorry to call so late, but there's something you need to know about Maria." John's heart clenched with sudden fear. "What's wrong? Is she hurt?" "She's in the hospital. Emergency room at LAC plus USC. Her youngest brother, Miguel, he was in an accident tonight. A hit and run. Maria has been there since 10 o'clock. The news hit John like a physical blow. While he had been wrestling with his own problems, Maria was dealing with a real crisis. Her brother, the boy she had helped raise, the family she had sacrificed so much for, was injured and possibly fighting for his life. "How bad is it?" John asked, already moving toward the nursery door with Emma still in his arms. "I don't know. My cousin just called. He said Maria needs help with medical bills, but she's too proud to ask anyone. John, she doesn't have insurance that covers everything. She's been working 3 jobs just to support her family. 3 jobs. John felt sick as the reality of Maria's situation became clear. While he had been offering her a position as Emma's nanny, she had been struggling to survive, taking whatever work she could find to support not just herself, but her brothers, and probably her mother too. "Which hospital did you say?" "Laxuski Medical Center. But John, it's very late, and I'm going there now," John said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Can you come stay with Emma?" "I can't leave her alone, but I need to. I need to be there for Maria." The drive through the empty streets of Los Angeles felt surreal. John had never been to LAC plus USC, had never had reason to venture into the parts of the city where people without excellent insurance went for emergency care. The contrast with the private medical facilities where Emma had been born was stark. fluorescent lighting, crowded waiting areas, the unmistakable smell of disinfectant and institutional food. He found Maria in the trauma unit waiting area, still wearing the same jeans and t-shirt from earlier, her face pale with exhaustion and worry. She looked up in shock as John approached, clearly not expecting to see him there. "John, what are you doing here? How did you—" "Elena called me," John said, sitting down beside her on the uncomfortable plastic chairs. "How is Miguel?" Maria's composure cracked slightly at the concern in his voice. "He has a concussion and some broken ribs. They're keeping him for observation, but the doctors think he'll be okay." She paused, then added quietly, "The bills, though. I don't know how I'm going to pay for all of this." "You don't need to worry about the bills," John said immediately. "I'll take care of everything. I can't let you do that." Maria's pride was evident even through her exhaustion. "This isn't your responsibility." "Maybe not," John agreed. "But you're not responsible for taking care of everyone in your family either, and yet you do it because you love them. Sometimes people help each other not because they have to, but because it's the right thing to do." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the controlled chaos of the emergency room around them. John realized that this was probably the first time in his adult life that he had been somewhere focused entirely on human need rather than profit or status. It was humbling and strangely clarifying. "Maria," John said finally, "I'm sorry for everything. For the way Victoria treated you, for not protecting you better, for not understanding what your help really meant until it was too late." Maria looked at him with tired eyes that held no anger, only sadness. "You were learning, John. We were all learning. But some lessons are harder than others." As dawn began to break over the city, John sat in that hospital waiting room and confronted the full scope of his failures. As a husband, as a father, as a human being who had allowed wealth and status to insulate him from the real struggles and joys of life. But for the first time, he also felt something else, the possibility that it wasn't too late to become the man Emma deserved to call her father. 2 weeks later, John stood before the hospital's administrative office with a briefcase full of documents that represented more than just financial transactions. They represented a complete reconstruction of his priorities. Miguel Santos was being discharged that morning, his medical bills fully paid. But John's involvement with the Santos family had evolved into something far more profound than emergency assistance. "Mr. Marshall," the financial counselor said, reviewing the paperwork with barely concealed amazement, "this covers not just Miguel's current treatment, but establishes a comprehensive medical fund for the entire Santos family. Are you certain about the scope of this commitment?" "Absolutely certain," John replied, signing the final documents. Through the office window, he could see Maria helping her brother into a wheelchair, her face bright with relief that John had rarely seen during their previous interactions. Miguel, a skinny 17-year-old with Maria's dark eyes and stubborn chin, was clearly eager to escape the hospital despite his injuries. The past 2 weeks had been a revelation. While Victoria remained at the Beverly Hills Hotel, communicating only through attorneys and formal letters, John had found himself drawn into Maria's world in ways he'd never anticipated. He'd attended Miguel's bedside consultations, met Maria's mother, a tiny, fierce woman named Carmen who spoke little English but whose gratitude was unmistakable, and begun to understand the complex web of relationships and responsibilities that defined Maria's life. More importantly, he'd brought Emma with him on many of these visits. The transformation in his daughter, when she was reunited with Maria, had been immediate and profound. Emma's face would light up at the sound of Maria's voice, her body would relax in Maria's arms, and the desperate crying that had characterized the weeks of separation would cease entirely. "She remembers you," John had observed during one of their hospital visits, watching Emma's obvious joy at being held by Maria again. "Babies don't forget love," Maria had replied simply, "even when people tried to convince them they should." Now, as Miguel's discharge process concluded, John found himself facing the most important conversation of his life. He'd spent sleepless nights planning what he wanted to say, but standing here in the hospital lobby with Maria and her family, all his carefully rehearsed words seemed inadequate. "Maria," he began, as they walked toward the parking garage, "I need to ask you something important." She looked up at him. Emma contentedly settled in her arms for the journey home. "What is it?" "I want you to marry me." The words hung in the air between them like an explosion, stopping Maria mid-step. Miguel, despite his injuries, let out a low whistle of surprise. Carmen, who had been chattering in rapid Spanish, fell silent. "John," Maria said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper, "what did you just say?" "I know how it sounds," John rushed on, aware that he was probably ruining everything, but unable to stop himself. "I know it seems crazy, impulsive, inappropriate, but I've been thinking about this for days, and it's not crazy. It's the sanest thing I've ever considered." Maria handed Emma to her mother and turned to face John fully. "You want to marry me? John, 2 weeks ago your wife fired me for overstepping boundaries. Now you're proposing marriage?" "Victoria filed for divorce 3 days ago," John said quietly. "She's claiming irreconcilable differences and demanding primary custody of Emma on the grounds that I'm experiencing some kind of psychological breakdown." The revelation clearly shocked Maria. "John, I'm so sorry. I had no idea things had gotten so serious. They got serious the moment I realized that everything I thought I wanted from life was actually keeping me from everything I actually needed." John's voice grew, stronger as he spoke. "Maria, I'm not proposing because I'm rebounding from a failed marriage. I'm proposing because you've shown me what love actually looks like." Carmen had been following the conversation despite the language barrier, and she stepped forward with Emma still in her arms. In broken but determined English, she addressed John directly. "You love my Maria?" she asked, her dark eyes fierce with protective concern. "Yes," John said without hesitation. "I love her courage, her kindness, her wisdom. I love the way she sees the world, the way she cares for people, the way she taught me to be a real father to my daughter." Carmen studied his face for a long moment, then turned to Maria and launched into rapid Spanish. John couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clearly one of serious maternal advice. Maria responded in the same language, her voice rising with what sounded like protest and confusion. "What is she saying?" John asked. Miguel, grinning despite his obvious discomfort, translated with obvious delight. "Mama is telling Maria that she's been waiting 25 years for a man to look at her the way you just did. She says Maria is an idiot if she lets pride get in the way of love." "Miguel!" Maria protested, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "She also says," Miguel continued, clearly enjoying himself, "that Emma needs a mother who already loves her, and that rich men who are willing to pay hospital bills and propose in parking garages might actually have their hearts in the right place." John felt a surge of gratitude toward Carmen. Santos that nearly brought tears to his eyes. This woman, who had every reason to be suspicious of wealthy men making dramatic gestures toward her daughter, was instead offering her blessing based on nothing more than her ability to read sincerity in his face. "Maria," John said, stepping closer, "I'm not asking you to marry me because you're convenient or because Emma needs a mother. I'm asking because I've realized that every good thing that's happened in my life recently has been connected to your presence in it. But John, think about this practically. Your world, my world, they're completely different. The kind of marriage you're used to, the social expectations, Forget my world," John interrupted. "Forget social expectations and what marriage is supposed to look like. I want to build something new, something real. I want to create a home where Emma can grow up surrounded by love instead of just luxury. I want to learn from your family what mine never taught me about being present for the people who matter." Maria was quiet for a long moment, looking down at Emma, who had begun making the small, contented sounds that indicated she was completely at peace. When Maria looked up again, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You really mean this?" she said. "And it wasn't a question. I mean it more than I've ever meant anything in my life." Maria glanced at her mother, who nodded encouragingly, then at Miguel, who was grinning like he was watching the best telenovela of his life. "Okay," Maria said quietly, then louder. "Okay, yes. Yes, I'll marry you." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, and full of promise. Emma, still in Carmen's arms, began to laugh, the first truly joyful sound. John had heard from his daughter since the day he'd discovered Maria singing lullabies in the nursery. As they stood there in the hospital parking garage, a millionaire tech executive, a cleaning woman, an injured teenager, an elderly immigrant, and a baby who had brought them all together, John realized that this was what family actually felt like. Not perfect, not conventional, but real in a way that all his money had never been able to purchase. The legal battles with Victoria would be complex, the social adjustments challenging, and the process of blending their vastly different worlds would require patience and compromise. But for the first time in his adult life, John felt like he was moving towards something worth fighting for, rather than running away from something he'd never really wanted. 6 months later, the Marshall estate had been transformed in ways that went far beyond physical changes, though those were immediately apparent to anyone who visited. The pristine white furniture had been replaced with comfortable pieces that could withstand sticky fingers and spilled juice. Colorful toys were scattered across Persian rugs that John had once insisted remain perfectly clean. The walls displayed not just expensive art, but photographs of family moments: Emma's first smile, Miguel's graduation, Carmen teaching John to make tamales in their renovated kitchen. The most significant change, however, was the sound of the house. Where once there had been only the hum of expensive electronics and the click of heels on marble, now there was laughter, conversations in both English and Spanish, and most importantly, the sound of Emma's constant babbling as she explored her world, with the fearless curiosity of a 10-month-old who felt completely secure in her environment. John stood in the nursery, now painted in warm yellows, in soft greens instead of the designer's cream and gold, watching his wife help Emma practice pulling herself up to standing. Maria wore one of the simple sundresses she'd bought with her first paycheck as the family's official child development coordinator, a title they'd created that captured her real role much better than Nanny ever could. "She's going to be walking within the month," Maria observed, steadying Emma as she wobbled on unsteady legs. "Look how determined she is." Emma had indeed inherited John's stubborn streak, but under Maria's patient guidance, that determination was manifesting as joyful persistence rather than frustrated demand. When she fell back onto her bottom, she immediately rolled over and tried again, laughing at her own efforts. "She gets that from you," John said, moving to sit beside them on the soft play mat that had replaced the expensive area rug. "The joy in trying, I mean. Before you came into our lives, I don't think I'd ever seen her laugh when things didn't go perfectly." Maria smiled, the expression that had become John's favorite sight in the world. "She gets it from both of us now. You should see yourself when you're teaching her new words. Yesterday you spent 20 minutes celebrating because she said Papa clearly." The memory made John grin. Emma's vocabulary was expanding daily, a mixture of English and Spanish words that reflected the bilingual household they'd created. Carmen, who had moved into the guest house behind the main property, was determined that Emma would grow up fluent in both languages, just as Miguel had started taking advanced placement courses at the private school John now funded. "Speaking of celebrations," John said, pulling an envelope from his pocket, "these came today." Maria opened the envelope carefully, her expression shifting from curiosity to amazement as she read the official documents inside. "The adoption papers are finalized. As of this morning, you are officially Emma's legal mother," John confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "And Miguel and Carmen are officially part of our family too, with all the legal protections that entails." The custody battle with Victoria had been brutal, but brief. When Victoria's attorneys discovered that John was prepared to demonstrate her complete absence from Emma's life, documented through nanny reports, medical records and testimony from household staff, she had agreed to a settlement that gave John primary custody in exchange for a substantial financial package. Victoria had remarried within 4 months, moving to New York with her new husband, and seemed genuinely relieved to be free of the maternal responsibilities she'd never wanted. Maria was crying now, happy tears that she wiped away quickly before Emma could notice and become concerned. "I can't believe it's real. 6 months ago, I was afraid to even hold her too long because your wife thought I was overstepping boundaries. 6 months ago, I was afraid to hold her at all because I didn't know how to be a father," John replied. "Look at us now." Indeed, the transformation in John was as dramatic as any other change in the household. He'd restructured his entire business approach, promoting key executives to handle day-to-day operations, while he focused on strategic decisions that could be made during Emma's nap times and after her bedtime. The company was actually performing better than ever, as if his increased happiness and focus had improved his decision-making across the board. More importantly, he'd learned to be present in ways he'd never imagined possible. He knew Emma's feeding schedule, her favorite books, which songs calmed her when she was fussy, and exactly how to make her giggle by tickling her feet. He could change diapers with one hand while conducting conference calls, and he'd become expert at reading bedtime stories in voices that made Emma clap with delight. "Mr. John, Miss Maria!" Miguel's voice called from downstairs, accompanied by the front door closing. At 18 now, he'd grown 3 inches taller and gained the confidence that came from being valued and supported. His college acceptance letters had arrived the week before, full scholarships to 3 different universities with plans to study medicine. "I brought pizza for everyone." The family dinners had become John's favorite part of each day. Around the large table they'd bought to accommodate everyone, conversations flowed between languages and generations. Carmen would update them on her citizenship classes. Miguel would share stories from his volunteer work at the hospital. Maria would report on Emma's developmental milestones, and John would find himself contributing not business achievements, but small domestic victories. Successfully assembling a high chair, mastering the art of baby-proofing cabinets, learning to braid Maria's hair. "I still can't believe this is my life," John admitted to Maria as they settled Emma in her high chair for dinner. "Some mornings I wake up expecting it all to be a dream." "What part seems most unreal?" Maria asked, cutting Emma's food into appropriately sized pieces while John poured drinks for everyone. John considered the question seriously. "The happiness, I think. I spent so many years believing that success meant accumulating things, achieving status, being important to people who didn't really know me. I never realized that happiness could be this simple." "It's not simple," Carmen interjected in her improving English, settling into her chair with the authority of the family matriarch she'd become. "Love is not simple, but it is real, and it is worth everything." As if to emphasize her great-grandmother's point, Emma began banging her sippy cup against her high-chair tray, creating a rhythm that made everyone laugh. She grinned at the response, clearly delighted to have caused such joy with her musical efforts. "She's going to be a performer," Miguel predicted, offering Emma a piece of banana that she accepted with enthusiasm. "Either that or a drummer. She's going to be whatever makes her happy," Maria said firmly. "That's what we're here for, to help her discover who she wants to become." Later that evening, after Miguel had left for his evening job at the community center and Carmen had retired to her apartment, John and Maria sat together on the porch swing they'd installed, overlooking the garden. Emma was finally asleep after her bedtime routine of bath, stories, and lullabies. Still the same Spanish songs Maria had been singing the first day John discovered them together. "Do you ever miss it?" Maria asked quietly. "The life you had before? The simplicity of only having to worry about yourself?" John considered the question, watching the lights of Los Angeles twinkle in the distance. "I miss the illusion that I was important," he said finally. "But I don't miss feeling empty. I don't miss coming home to a house that felt like a museum. I don't miss being so isolated that I could go days without having a real conversation with another human being." He turned to face Maria, taking her hand in his. "What I have now is real importance. I'm important to Emma, to you, to Miguel and Carmen. Not because of what I can provide, but because of who I choose to be every day. That's worth more than all the business success in the world." Maria squeezed his hand, then leaned against his shoulder as they swayed gently on the swing. "Emma's lucky to have you as a father." "Emma's lucky to have all of us," John corrected. "And so am I." Inside the house, Emma stirred in her crib, making the small sounds that meant she was dreaming. Through the baby monitor, they could hear her soft breathing, the occasional sigh, the rustle of blankets as she settled deeper into sleep. John closed his eyes and listened to the sound of his daughter sleeping safely, surrounded by a family that had formed not through blood or obligation, but through the simple decision to choose love over fear, presence over perfection, and authentic connection over social expectations. For the first time in his life, John Marshall was exactly where he belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.